Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now we recently tested the Ryzen 5 5500X3D, AMD's latest socket AM4 processor. As an X3D chip it has a large L3 cache, making it a great choice for a gaming build, especially if you're still using something like a Ryzen 3600 and want to upgrade without the expense of a new motherboard or DDR5 RAM. I found that it also seems to work just fine in a very basic A320 motherboard, so if you're new to the platform altogether, you don't need to overspend on a board to get it running at its maximum 3950 MHz all-core clock speed. Today we'll be comparing this 6-core 12-thread 5500X3D to the legendary i5 12400F from Intel. This is probably one of my favourite CPUs available, as it's a great all-rounder for the price. It works with DDR4 or DDR5 RAM, though you'll likely see higher frame rates and more consistent frame times in most games when using the latter, albeit more expensive but faster memory. This also has 6 cores and 12 threads and is based on the 1700 socket. Some say socket 1700 is dead, but that term makes no sense to me. After all, there is still a solid upgrade path that ends with an i7 or i9 CPUs that will still be offering solid frame rates in games for years to come. Anyway, the 5500X3D versus the 12400F. The Ryzen chip is easily found on AliExpress, though its retail availability elsewhere seems lacking, especially here in the UK. The 12400F is plentiful, especially on the used market, though the price of it has definitely been creeping up lately. Hasn't everything? If you plan on doing a lot of editing and rendering, then more cores and threads would be ideal, but both of these chips can certainly handle DaVinci Resolve, for example, fairly smoothly. My custom rendering test revealed a near identical time. This time was the same for the i5 with DDR4 or DDR5. I'm using 32 gigs of 3000 MHz DDR4 today in two 16GB modules, and I've also tested the i5 with 6000 MHz DDR5, again in a 2x16GB configuration. I've paired both chips with a 4070 Super and tested at 1080p, which allows us to get a better idea of CPU performance by removing a potential GPU bottleneck. I still recommend the 12400F, to be honest, whether you pair it with DDR4 or DDR5, as it's going to produce some pretty respectable numbers, and it's worth mentioning that this can also be used on a pretty basic board. I've had mine as part of a cheap H610M motherboard for ages, and it's never struggled to reach its 4GHz all-core clock. It's easy to get caught up in price comparisons with newer gen and different chips, so it's always worth checking out reviews of different CPUs to see how they compare in performance and price where you live. But as always, I like to keep these comparisons to a one-by-one basis, so let's see how these two do. I'll put the results over some gameplay captured from the 5500X3D machine today. So for our first result we have Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p with the Ultra preset. Here the 5500X3D with DDR4 3000 MHz memory pulled ahead of the i5 with both DDR5 and DDR4. If we just talk about the DDR4 results, and this probably applies to every game tested, then the 5500X3D is going to dominate the 12400F. Basically with that slower memory. As you can see, even with this initial result, there is quite a substantial difference. The i5 with 6000 MHz DDR5 does close the gap, of course, and it's a very similar gaming experience. In fact, the percentile lows were actually a bit better with the i5, but then you do have to purchase that more expensive memory in order to get these results. For Counter-Strike 2, well, the 5500X3D pulled way ahead with 348 FPS, a 1% low of 137, and a 0.1% low of 101. The next closest result was still quite far away, that was 262 frames per second for the i5 with DDR5 memory, which bettered the i5 with DDR4 memory by about 12 frames per second overall. For GTA 5 Enhanced, I'm using the maximum RT preset with TAA. Once again, the 5500X3D with its dual channel DDR4 came out on top, and this was the only result whereby we saw over 100 FPS in this game, compared to the i5 which hit 98 during our benchmark run. Still a very respectable result, and as you can see, this is still a step up from the DDR4 memory where we saw 86 FPS. Still a pretty solid result, especially when you look at those consistent percentile lows, but there is a clear winner in this one. With Forza Horizon 6, well, this is where things start to fall back in favour of the i5. I actually noticed that the game felt a bit more stuttery on the AMD chip. The i5 with DDR5 6000MHz memory hit 110 frames per second. This was followed closely by the 5500X3D with 105 FPS. As you can see, the percentile lows were still okay, but this scored the worst in terms of that 0.1% low frame rate, coming in at just 55. With DDR4 in the i5 system, we still got a pretty decent 95 FPS average, and once again, those percentile lows were pretty good. When it comes to Crimson Desert, the 5500X3D just about edged it here with 1 frame per second, but this is margin of error territory here. Wasn't really a noticeable gameplay difference, and I think the same can be said for the percentile lows as well. We're looking at 58 and 50 compared to 60 and 52 with the i5 and DDR5. Both of these results were a substantial step up from the i5 with DDR4 in the system, where we saw 80 FPS. Though having said that, the percentile lows weren't worlds away. Let's finalise then with Battlefield 6, and this time around the results fell once again back in favour of the i5 12400F with of course DDR5 in the system, 143 frames per second, though this was followed quite closely by the 5500X3D with the 3000MHz DDR4, which scored an average of 135, a 1% low of 102 and a 0.1% low of 90, so not too different between these top results here. Of course, with DDR4, the 12400F hit just 111 frames per second. I say just, but it was still a pretty good result if you ask me. And when we look at those percentile lows, 88 and 77, they do still show pretty decent consistency as well. Now there are a couple of different variables we could consider if we're using even faster DDR4 for the 5500X3D, for example. You may find that it still pulls ahead of the i5 in every scenario, but then if we were using faster DDR5 with the i5, that could again extend the gap. The gap may also close a little bit if the 12400F was using faster DDR4, but then again, if the 5500X3D was using faster DDR4, that gap could widen. So there are plenty of things to consider. Just go with the fastest RAM you can afford, basically. That goes for DDR4 or DDR5. If you do have DDR4 memory and you plan to build a system around that, you're trying to decide between something like the 12400F and 5500X3D, then yeah, the 5500X3D is certainly going to be the better choice, but it is a bit more expensive from what I've seen, and you do have to wonder how perhaps the 13400F or 14400F would compare in terms of performance and price, so be sure to look into that as well. As for this one, well, I hope you found the results interesting and useful, and I hope to see you all again in the next one.